Hello everybody and welcome to another Panelino Bambino video. Today we're going to be doing something a little bit different, something that I've been meaning to do for quite some time, which is a top 5 list or a top 10 list or something along those lines. I know these are a little bit gimmicky, but I think they give sort of a fun way to talk about characters and maps and stuff like that in different contexts that isn't like a tier list or talking about the whole cast or something like that. So to start, this is one that I've been wanting to make for quite some time. What we're going to be doing is looking at the characters that improved the most from Path of Radiance to Radiant Dawn. So all the characters except for one from Path of Radiance are recruitable in Radiant Dawn, and we're going to be looking at who got better. So this isn't like just a statistic thing or something like that. It's more of like a usability and like a tier list type thing. Who was not very useful in Path of Radiance, but is really useful in Radiant Dawn, or just the biggest difference between those two. So this is mostly a top 5 list. I feel really good about my top 5, but I have a bunch of honorable mentions. I almost made it a top 10, but I think a lot of these sort of have problems with them being on this list. So I just wanted to want to run through the honorable mentions, and then it's mostly a top 5 list. So we'll start with Ulki and Jannaf. These two are pretty bad in Path of Radiance. Jannaf is actually pretty usable, but Ulki is quite bad. They're just recruited pretty late. Lagoos are better in that game than they are in Radiant Dawn, but yeah, Jannaf immediately, he just doesn't deal a ton of damage, even though he does double right away. But he's just not going to be as good as your other units, and they're not going to be as good going forward. Radiant Dawn, however, these two are actually pretty good. Unfortunately, they're not recruited that early or usable on that many chapters. But the chapters they are usable on, they're actually quite strong. They have just a ton of speed. Unfortunately, Lagoos are just really bad in this game, and they do get destroyed by crossbows, which means you have to be really careful with them. But other than that, they have really, really good stats. So I like them quite a bit in Radiant Dawn, and they're not very good in Path of Radiance. All right, next up I have Ilyana. So Ilyana is sort of a meme pick, and my next one is also going to be sort of a meme pick. But the reason I have Ilyana on here is because even though she's actually quite good in Path of Radiance, she's actually really good in Path of Radiance. In Radiant Dawn, she has arguably the most important task of anybody in the whole game, which is offering you that link in inventory space between the Dawn Brigade and the Grail Mercenaries, which is really important because money on the Grail Mercenaries is really important, a lot more important than the Dawn Brigade, and stuff like the Paragon skill is also extremely important. Obviously, this is a bit of a meme because as far as her like combat and stuff like that is concerned, she's not very good in Radiant Dawn. She's actually really good in Path of Radiance. Uh, but she's the only one that could offer that utility, so I decided to kind of mention her here because I think it's sort of funny. All right, next up we have Oliver, who's also fairly memey to put on here. But I decided to. Obviously, it's pretty much a meme. He's not recruitable in Path of Radiance, but he is a really annoying boss if you play on Maniac. He has a ton of health, ton of luck. Nosferatu's really annoying to deal with. He's just a pain. In Radiant Dawn, on the other hand, not only is he recruitable, but he also is a boss, which means that he essentially kills a boss for free, which is pretty useful. Him as a character is just okay. He can offer you some decent like staff utility really late in the game, but he's essentially never going to be deployed by you. But you don't have to fight him, so that's kind of nice. Next up, we have Rolf, who I just wanted to touch on here. Rolf is really bad in Path of Radiance, which is pretty much the only reason I decided to put him on this list. He's also really bad in Radiant Dawn, but at least he can offer you a little bit of utility in Radiant Dawn. He's really bad in Path of Radiance, like arguably the best unit in the entire game. So he's bad in both games, but I decided to put him on here just because he's so bad in Path of Radiance. But again, this is just an honorable mention. All right, next up in our honorable mentions, we have Nephenee. Nephenee is quite bad in Path of Radiance. Not as bad as Rolf, of course, but still quite bad. And when you look at her sort of deployment and usability and stats and stuff in Radiant Dawn, she's also really bad. But Nephenee has the advantage in Radiant Dawn of being one of 2 units along with Brom to be deployed on, I think, every part 2 chapter except for the Joffrey chapter. So you're basically forced to use her, especially in the first chapter, and she can offer you some decent combat. She's not nearly as good as Brom in Radiant Dawn, but she's quite bad in Path of Radiance and actually has some really good usage in Radiant Dawn. So I decided to list her as an honorable mention here. All right, next up we have 2 units who sort of fall into the same category. So I decided to kind of put them together, and that's Shinnon and Gatrie. Both these units have a fairly similar sort of trajectory in Path of Radiance, where they offer really good combat really early in the game, which is extremely useful. So they're actually quite good in Path of Radiance, both of them. And then when they're re-recruited, they're both quite bad. Gatrie can at least offer a little bit of combat, but he's pretty much pretty terrible at that point. He can get like obliterated by basically any mage that looks at him funny, and by the time Shinnon's recruited, he's essentially useless. So the reason I didn't have them in the top five is because they're actually quite good in Path of Radiance. Irradiant Dawn, these two are actually really good, and they're standouts on a Grail Mercenary squad that's loaded with really strong units. Gatrie's awesome. He's actually pretty fast, even though that speed cap of 23 is kind of unfortunate. It can offer you really good combat and is kind of immortal, sort of. And Shinnon is one of the best units on the Grail Mercenaries. He's awesome. He's just got pretty good strength, really good defense. He doubles everything. He gets 3 range once he promotes. Marksman's a really good class. Yeah, Shinnon is awesome in this game. But again, they're both pretty good in Path of Radiance, so I didn't decide to put them in the top 5. Okay, now we're into the top 5. So these are units that I feel really confident about, who are pretty bad in Path of Radiance, but actually really good in Radiant Dawn. So the first one, I mentioned him earlier, we have Brom. So Brom is one of the worst characters in Path of Radiance. He's terrible. He's not as bad as someone like Rolf because he can offer a little bit of defense utility right after he's recruited, but he's a terrible class. He's just worse than Gatrie in basically every way. Not much to talk about him. He's terrible in Path of Radiance. In Radiant Dawn, however, Brom is actually pretty good. Mostly because of the same reasons that I mentioned with Nephenee. He's recruited or deployable on basically every part 2 chapter, making him arguably the best unit in part 2. I mean, Haar's in part 2, but he's not on as many chapters as Brom is. Brom has really good strength. He can't double anything, but he hits really hard, and he takes hits extremely well. Just like Nephenee, once you recruit him with the mercenaries, he definitely falls off, but even then he can offer you a little bit of combat, at least more combat than her. Um, and so yeah, he goes from being just a terrible unit to actually a pretty decent unit because of his utility in Radiant Dawn. All right, and coming in at number 4, we have one of 2 Myrmidons that's in my top 5, and that is Zihakr. So Myrmidons are terrible in Path of Radiance, arguably the worst class in maybe the whole game, or at least up there. I mean, Myrmidons and Swordmasters are pretty much never good in Fire Emblem games, although they're actually pretty good in Radiant Dawn, which we'll talk about in a second. But yeah, unfortunately, they don't have 2 range, which is a big deal in Path of Radiance. They don't have good movement, and being sword locked is just really unfortunate because that's a game that's dominated by lances and especially axes. And the fact that you have to use swords is just really unfortunate. Uh, Zahark's going to really struggle to deal damage in the mid to late game. In Radiant Dawn, however, Zark's actually a really nice unit. He's a pre-promote that you get with the Dawn Brigade, which immediately makes him really useful because the Dawn Brigade is terrible, and his ability to offer some decent stats is really nice. I don't think Zihakr is like a spectacular unit in Radiant Dawn, but he is quite useful. He doesn't have very good HP, and his defense kind of blows, but he doubles everything, and he hits fairly hard, which is just nice. Again, stats are really important with the Dawn Brigade. The Dawn Brigade is so weak in that game. By the time you're getting to the part 3 Dawn Brigade chapters, Zihakr has definitely fallen off. But again, you're still really, really hard up for any kind of stats and utility and stuff. So he's pretty darn good in Radiant Dawn, and he's really bad in Path of Radiance. All right, and coming in at number 3, we have a character who actually inspired this list because I like her a lot in Radiant Dawn, and she's really awful in Path of Radiance. I had her at 2, but then when I reevaluated the cast, I decided that somebody else maybe should be a little bit better than her. But nonetheless, coming in number 3, I have Mia. So Mia, all the same stuff I just mentioned about Zihakr in Path of Radiance. She's absolutely terrible. Maybe the worst unit in the whole game. Maybe even worse than Rolf, if I'm being honest. Maybe not. Rolf's quite bad. But she's terrible. She can't do anything in that game. You can certainly train and promote her, but she's going to fall off in a couple of chapters. She just doesn't have the strength, and her class is terrible. She's really bad. One of the worst characters in all of Path of Radiance. And yet somehow she's really good in Radiant Dawn. It's weird. And it's different from Zihakr, because Zahark's utility in Radiant Dawn mostly comes from how bad the Dawn Brigade is. But Mia's on a team, the Grail Mercenaries, with a ton of strong units. I mentioned Shinnon, there's Titania, Ike is really good. So why is Mia so good? There's a few reasons for this. Number one, Mia can double. And doubling is actually a big deal. This is sort of the Rucker thing for Fire Emblem 6. Um, normally having a ton more speed than everyone else doesn't really matter, but when enemy stats are quite high, as they are in Radiant Dawn, it's actually a big deal to be able to double. A lot of units can't. Her strength is also actually pretty good. It's not nearly as bad as it is in Path of Radiance. Uh, Swordmasters in general are better because swords have 1-2 range in the form of like storm swords and stuff like that. And Mia can actually dodge tank in a game where dodge tanking is like not something you can really do, because the way that biorhythms work in Radiant Dawn means that it's really hard to dodge tank. You really need that defense because you never know what the enemy hit is going to be. But with Mia, even when her biorhythm is really low, she's so fast and has so much luck that she actually can kind of dodge tank. And that's sort of used in conjunction with decent HP and defense, meaning that even if it doesn't work out and she does get hit, she can actually take hits okay. Mia is definitely one of the best characters on the Ground Mercenaries and a very good character in Radiant Dawn, and just one of the worst in Path of Radiance. All right, so coming in at number 2 is a character that I actually hadn't thought about because I always forget that he's in Path of Radiance. But when I reevaluated the cast from Radiant Dawn and Path of Radiance, I noticed that he should definitely be on this list, and that is Sothe. So Sothe in Path of Radiance is essentially not a character in the game. He's a thief, which means he shares utility with Volk, who's recruited earlier and has better stats. He can't promote. Not that that really matters. Volk isn't good because he can promote. And there's not a lot of like doors to open or chests to open in Path of Radiance. I will say that Sothe at least has a little bit of utility, because if you lose Volk, he can he's your only opportunity to do that. But again, there's just not that much utility to be had for thieves in Path of Radiance. So there's I know I keep saying this for every character, but maybe the worst character in all of Path of Radiance. He's quite bad. In Radiant Dawn, however, Sothe is one of the best characters in the entire game because he is the Jagan of arguably the most difficult stretch in the game, which is the Dawn Brigade. Now, unfortunately, Sothe is a rogue, which is just a really bad class. They do give knives in the game, which allows for 1-2 range, but knives are really bad, and so are daggers. They just have really bad damage. But Sothe can double everybody throughout the first part of the game. He takes hits fairly well, and he deals decent damage despite his knives and daggers. So, yeah, Sothe is awesome. He does fall off once you get out of the first part of the Dawn Brigade, but he's still fairly useful and can use stuff like the Beast Killer to help you out with certain chapters, and he's so important for the early game. So I think an easy number 2 slot is very deserving of Sothe. Maybe even number 1, because he goes from one of the worst characters to one of the best. But number 1 is kind of a unique case. So, all right. And finally, rounding out our list, we have number 1. If you know anything about Path of Radiance or Radiant Dawn, you probably know where this is going. It's pretty obvious, and that is, of course, Largo. So Largo is a pretty mediocre character in Path of Radiance. He's recruited extremely late. He can hit pretty hard, but he doesn't have good defense, and he can't double, and he often gets doubled. But in Radiant Dawn, Largo does arguably the most important thing of any character in the game, and that's stay home and raise his adopted daughter. Now, while everybody else is going out there and fighting in this war, doing whatever, right? Essentially ruining the world by awakening a devil that blows up the world, or whatever the plot of that game was. Largo is at home making sure that his adopted daughter is taken care of. So easy number 1, obviously Largo. All right, obviously this isn't the case, although it is kind of interesting. I wanted to mention Largo is the only character in Path of Radiance who does not make a reappearance in Radiant Dawn. The lore reason is that he is taking care of him and Khalil's daughter, which is a big deal. You got to give it up to my man, and he is pretty terrible in Path of Radiance. But yeah, no, the real number 1, and this is also probably pretty obvious if you know about Path of Radiance, Radiant Dawn, is of course Haar. Haar in Path of Radiance is an okay unit. He is recruited really late. He's a really good class, but his stats aren't particularly strong. He can offer you some decent utility, especially on chapters like Clash, where you're going to deploy a lot of your team, but he's not very good. And in Radiant Dawn, he is by far the best character in the entire game. Maybe one of the best characters in all of Fire Emblem, given the context of their game. He's awesome. He's an amazing class. One of the big benefits of his class is that they're not effective damage isn't by ranged in this game. So like bows and especially crossbows. So where characters like Marcia or Tanith have to be really careful about crossbows, and Jannaf and Ulki, Haar doesn't have to worry about that. Basically anything that isn't thunder magic can't deal like any damage to him. His stats are insane. His ability to be deployed is also really high. Part of the problem with a lot of the characters in this game is that they kind of go in and out. Some chapters you can use him, some chapters you can't. But Haar is great because you can use him a decent amount of part 2, and he's dominant in the couple of chapters you can deploy him for. It's actually only 2. But he's also deployed or recruited pretty early in the Ground Mercenaries chapters, and is basically usable for every chapter after that. and he's absolutely dominant. Easily the best character in Radiant Dawn, and so I think it's hard to say he's not number one. Potentially, you could say Sothe, because Sothe is also really important in Radiant Dawn, and he's so bad at Path of Radiance. Whereas Haar is actually okay in Path of Radiance, but it's hard to not put Haar at number one whenever you're doing a list like this. All right, so that's my list. Do you agree with me? Do you not agree with me? Do you think I'm an idiot? Whatever. Feel free to comment down below if you feel like I missed a character or you think some characters should be rearranged. Whatever. As I said, this is a video format that I'd like to do a little bit more of going forward. We're going to be doing the other side of this, so characters who got quite a bit worse from Path of Radiance to Radiant Dawn, and there's a lot of those, so that should be a fun list. So I'll go ahead and get that up as quickly as I can. But yeah, I want to thank everybody for watching as always, and I will see you in the next one.